The Mafia Boss's newborn son seemed untouchable, wrapped in silk blankets, guarded by men with cold eyes, and cradled in a penthouse nursery that smelled of money and fear. But each morning the baby looked smaller, lighter, quieter, as if something unseen was stealing him away 1 ounce at a time. Doctors blamed rare conditions, stress, genetics, anything that sounded expensive enough to be true. The father's threats filled the hallways, yet the scales kept dropping. Then a nurse, exhausted but sharp, stopped listening to the shouting and started watching the details. The timing of feedings, the order of visitors, the shift changes, the bottles swapped by accident, the same lullaby humming from a phone every night. The pattern wasn't hidden in shadows. It was sitting right there in plain sight, repeating itself with perfect, terrifying precision. The silence in the nursery was wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping child, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that preceded catastrophe. Camilla Reyes pressed her fingers against the baby monitor, checking the volume for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The green light blinked steadily, confirming what her eyes already knew. Milo Santoro was awake, but he wasn't crying. At 10 months old, he should have been babbling, reaching for toys, demanding attention with the relentless energy of a healthy infant. Instead, he lay motionless in his ivory crib, his dark eyes tracking the shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling of the Upper East Side mansion. His breathing was shallow, labored in a way that made Camilla's chest tighten with professional alarm. She had worked pediatric cases for 15 years, had seen failure to thrive in children from broken homes, neglectful families, poverty-stricken environments. But Milo Santoro was the son of one of New York's most powerful men. He had access to everything: the finest foods, the most expensive medical care, round-the-clock supervision. Yet here he was, wasting away as if invisible hands were stealing his life force drop by drop. The nursery itself was a testament to wealth and careful planning. Hand-painted murals depicted peaceful forest scenes. Custom furniture crafted from sustainable hardwoods gleamed under soft LED lighting, and a small library of developmental toys sat untouched on pristine shelves. Everything a child could need, except the one thing that seemed to matter: the ability to thrive. Camilla lifted Milo from his crib, her trained hands immediately cataloging what her eyes had been documenting for weeks. His weight had dropped another few ounces since yesterday. His skin, though clean and well-maintained, had taken on a translucent quality that spoke of malnutrition. Most disturbing of all, he didn't fight her hold or reach for her face the way babies typically did. He simply accepted her touch with the resigned passivity of someone much older, much more defeated. "What's happening to you, little one?" she whispered, settling into the rocking chair that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The question had been haunting her for 3 weeks, ever since she'd started working for the Santoro family. She had been hired specifically because of her reputation: pediatric cases, difficult children, medical complexity. Matteo Santoro didn't settle for second best in anything, including the care of his son. But now Camilla wondered if her expertise was being tested in ways she'd never anticipated. She had run through every possibility in her medical training: feeding intolerance, digestive disorders, metabolic conditions, genetic abnormalities. She had suggested tests, consultations, second opinions. The family had complied with everything, shuttling between Massachusetts General, NYU Langone, New York Presbyterian. The most advanced medical facilities in the country had examined Milo Santoro and found nothing definitively wrong. Yet he was dying, slowly, silently, inexplicably, but dying nonetheless. Camilla's phone buzzed against her hip, a text from Elisa Moreno, the new babysitter who worked the evening shift. "Can you stay late tonight? Something feels wrong. I need to talk to someone who understands." The message sent ice through Camilla's veins. Elisa was young, perhaps 22, with the kind of intuitive understanding of children that couldn't be taught. If she sensed something wrong beyond what they could already see, it meant the situation was worse than any of them had dared to acknowledge. As if summoned by her growing dread, footsteps echoed in the marble hallway outside the nursery. Heavy, deliberate, expensive shoes against polished stone. Matteo Santoro's presence filled doorways before he entered them. a combination of physical stature, carefully controlled power, and the weight of expectations that had been building around his name for 35 years. He appeared in the nursery doorway, his dark suit impeccable despite the late hour, his expression unreadable in the way that had made him legendary in boardrooms and feared in negotiations. But Camilla had learned to read the micro-expressions that slipped past his careful control. The tension around his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands remained motionless at his sides instead of reaching for his son, all signs of a man fighting panic. "How is he?" The question was quiet, almost conversational, but Camilla heard the edge beneath it. "The same," she replied, offering truth instead of comfort. In 3 weeks of working for this family, she had learned that Matteo Santoro valued honesty above everything else, even when it hurt. He moved into the room with the careful control of someone who had learned early that showing weakness was dangerous. But when he looked at his son, really looked, something cracked in his composure. For just a moment, Camilla glimpsed the fear that lived beneath the power, the desperate love that existed alongside the crushing weight of responsibility. "The doctor said—" "The doctors don't know," Camilla interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Santoro, I've been thinking. Maybe we need to look beyond medical causes. Maybe we need to examine everything, routine, environment, everyone who has access to Milo." The suggestion hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to voice. In the soft glow of the nursery lights, surrounded by evidence of wealth and privilege, they were confronting the possibility that something much darker was stealing this child's life. Matteo's phone rang, cutting through the tension. He answered without looking away from his son. "Santoro." A pause, then his expression hardened. "No, not tonight. Handle it yourself." He ended the call and looked at Camilla with the intensity that had built an empire. "What do you need?" "Help," she said simply. "And someone else I trust to confirm what I'm seeing." "Done." As Camilla rocked Milo in the designer chair, watching Matteo Santoro make calls that would mobilize resources most people couldn't imagine, she felt the weight of what they were about to uncover. Whatever was happening to this child, it was about to change everything for everyone in this house. The silence in the nursery was still wrong, but now, finally, someone was listening. "Hi, viewer. Thanks for being here. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what you thought of the story and what city you're watching from right now. Let's continue the story." The fluorescent lights in Brooklyn General's pediatric ward hummed with the relentless persistence of exhaustion itself. Dr. Clara Wynne pressed her back against the supply closet door, allowing herself 30 seconds of stillness before the next crisis demanded her attention. Her scrubs, wrinkled from a 12-hour shift that had somehow stretched to 16, bore the evidence of her day: coffee stains, hand sanitizer marks, and the invisible weight of too many decisions made with too little sleep. Her phone buzzed against her hip, the 4th call from the billing department in 2 days. She didn't need to answer to know what they wanted. The same thing everyone wanted lately: money she didn't have for debts she couldn't escape. Medical school loans that had seemed manageable when she believed pediatrics would offer financial stability. Jade's mounting medical expenses that insurance refused to cover. The rent on their shared apartment in Bed-Stuy that had doubled in the past 2 years as gentrification crept through their neighborhood like slow poison. Clara silenced the phone without looking at the screen. Whatever they wanted could wait. Everything could wait except the children who needed her hands steady and her mind clear. Dr. Wynne, a resident, appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression urgent. "Room 314 needs you. 7-year-old with respiratory distress." She pushed off from the door, muscle memory taking over as her training kicked in. This was the part that still made sense: the medicine, the healing, the moments when knowledge and instinct converged to save a life. Everything else was noise. Room 314 contained chaos barely contained by professional competence. The child, a little girl with braided hair and frightened eyes, struggled for each breath while her mother clutched her hand and spoke rapid Spanish to anyone who would listen. Clara's hands moved automatically, checking vitals, adjusting oxygen flow, ordering medications, while her voice remained calm and reassuring in both English and her college Spanish. 20 minutes later, The crisis passed. The girl's breathing eased, her color improved, and her mother's tears shifted from terror to relief. Clara documented everything, knowing that this child's family would receive a bill they couldn't afford for care they desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days saving children whose families faced the same impossible financial choices that kept her awake at night. The subway ride home gave her 45 minutes to decompress, though decompression felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She closed her eyes and let the rhythmic clacking of the train transport her away from the hospital's controlled chaos. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could almost pretend she was heading home to a life that made sense: a comfortable apartment, financial security, a future that extended beyond the next crisis. Instead, she was heading home to Jade. Their apartment building stood like a testament to benign neglect, functional but forgettable, with a lobby that smelled of industrial cleaner and disappointment. Clara climbed 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 3 weeks, and the landlord's promises of repair had become background noise. She found Jade exactly where she'd left her that morning, curled on the couch with her laptop, surrounded by medical journals and research papers that she insisted on reading despite Clara's protests. At 25, Jade looked younger, her illness having stripped away weight and color until she resembled a sketch of herself. But her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had carried her through medical school until her body betrayed her. "You look like hell," Jade said, without looking up from her screen. "Good evening to you, too." Clara dropped her bag and collapsed into the chair across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying slowly, which, according to these latest studies, I am." Jade's voice carried the dark humor that had become her default coping mechanism. "But I found something interesting about experimental treatments in Germany. There's a clinic in Berlin that's had promising results with Jade, a combination therapy that's showing significant improvement in liver function, and if we could figure out how to get there—" "Jade, stop!" The laptop snapped shut. Jade's composure cracked just enough to reveal the fear underneath, the knowledge that her kidneys were failing, that dialysis was buying time rather than providing solutions, that the transplant list was long, and her position on it was precarious. "I can't stop, Clara. If I stop researching, stop planning, stop believing there's a way out of this, then what's left? Sitting here waiting to die?" Clara moved to the couch, gathering Jade into her arms the way she had since they'd met in medical school 7 years ago. They weren't related by blood, but they'd chosen each other as family, when their actual families had proven inadequate to the task. Jade's parents had disowned her for pursuing medicine instead of the engineering career they'd planned. Clara's had simply never been present enough to have an opinion. "You're not dying on my watch," Clara said fiercely. "I won't let that happen." "You can't save everyone, Clara. Sometimes the math just doesn't work out." But Clara had never accepted mathematics as the final word on anything. She had learned early that the world was divided into people who accepted limitations and people who found ways around them. Medical school had taught her that healing required both scientific knowledge and stubborn refusal to surrender. Jade's illness had taught her that love meant being willing to fight battles that seemed impossible to win. Her phone rang, interrupting the moment. Unknown number, which usually meant debt collectors or telemarketers. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Dr. Wynn, this is Elisa Moreno. I got your number from Dr. Rodriguez at Brooklyn General. I need help, and he said you were someone who cared about children even when it was complicated." The voice was young, nervous, carrying an accent that spoke of recent immigration and careful English learned from necessity rather than comfort. Clara found herself sitting straighter, her medical instincts engaging despite her exhaustion. "What kind of help?" "I work as a babysitter for a family in Manhattan, a very powerful family. Their baby is sick, and I think something terrible is happening. The doctors can't find anything wrong, but he's getting worse every day. There's a nurse here, Camilla Reyes. Do you know her?" Clara's breath caught. She knew Camilla by reputation, a pediatric nurse with an impeccable record, someone who had presented at conferences Clara attended when she could afford the registration fees. If Camilla Reyes thought something was wrong, it was worth investigating. "To what exactly do you think is happening?" I can't say over the phone, but Dr. Wynne, this baby is going to die if someone doesn't help him. And I think his mother might be the reason why." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that made Clara's chest tighten. Child abuse cases were the hardest part of her job, the ones that followed her home and invaded her dreams. But they were also the cases where her intervention could mean the difference between life and death for someone who had no voice to advocate for themselves. "Where is this family?" "Upper East Side, the Santoro family." "Please, Dr. Wynne, will you come?" Clara looked at Jade, who was watching her with knowing eyes. They both understood what this call represented. Another complicated situation, another child who needed help, another choice between safety and moral obligation. "I'll be there tomorrow," Clara said. After she hung up, Jade reached for her hand. "You know you can't save this one either if you don't save yourself first." "I know," Clara said, but they both knew she was lying. She had never learned how to walk away from a child who needed help, even when helping might cost her everything she had left. Outside their window, Brooklyn stretched toward Manhattan, separated by water and wealth and 1,000 invisible barriers. Tomorrow, Clara would cross those barriers and enter a world where her skills might be the only thing standing between a child and disaster. Tonight, she held Jade close and pretended that saving others wasn't slowly killing them both. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Santoro Tower commanded Manhattan like a war room commands a battlefield. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of Central Park, the city spreading beneath like a map of conquered territory. Matteo Santoro stood with his back to the mahogany conference table, watching the morning light fracture against glass and steel, while 12 of the most powerful men in New York waited for his attention. He didn't hurry to give it to them. Power, Matteo had learned early, was as much about silence as it was about speech. Let them wait. Let them wonder. Let them remember that in this room, in this building, in the intricate web of influence that stretched from Wall Street to Washington, nothing moved without his permission. "Gentlemen?" His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the authority of someone who had never learned to ask for anything. He turned from the window, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room from anxious anticipation to focused attention, the Henderson acquisition. For the next hour, he dissected a billion-dollar merger with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a predator. Every detail had been anticipated, every contingency planned, every potential obstacle neutralized before it could become a problem. This was how Matteo Santoro had built an empire by the age of 35, through absolute control and the refusal to accept failure as an option. His phone buzzed discreetly against the table. Mikhail Orlov, his head of security, never interrupted meetings unless the situation demanded immediate attention. Matteo glanced at the message. "Nurse requesting outside consultation. Recommend approval." The meeting continued around him, but his focus fractured. For 3 weeks, Milo's condition had dominated his thoughts in ways that surprised him. He had expected fatherhood to be manageable, another responsibility to delegate to capable professionals. Instead, he found himself checking on his son at odd hours, standing in the nursery doorway, watching the rise and fall of small chest, cataloguing every change in breathing patterns or skin tone. The medical establishment had failed him. Massachusetts General, NYU Langone, New York Presbyterian, institutions where his donations funded entire research wings, had examined Milo with every available technology and found nothing definitive. It was the first time in Matteo's adult life that money and influence hadn't been enough to solve a problem. "Sir?" His assistant's voice cut through his distraction. The boardroom had emptied while he'd been lost in thought, a lapse in attention that would have been unthinkable before Milo's illness. "Clear my afternoon," he said, already moving toward the door, "and call the house. I want to speak with Camilla Reyes." The elevator descended 42 floors in silence, carrying him from the world where he controlled everything to the one place where his power felt meaningless. His penthouse apartment occupied the top 3 floors of the building, connected to his offices by private elevator, and surrounded by security measures that most heads of state would envy. But all the protection in the world couldn't shield a 10-month-old baby from an enemy they couldn't identify. The transition from executive suite to family residence was marked by subtle changes, warmer lighting, softer textures, the kind of calculated comfort that interior designers specialized in creating for people who had forgotten how to feel at home anywhere. Matteo moved through rooms that cost more to furnish than most people earned in years, but his attention was focused on the sounds emanating from the nursery. Camilla Reyes met him in the hallway, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes holding the kind of concern that couldn't be trained or faked. She had worked for the family for 3 weeks, recommended by the same agency that provided household staff to half the Upper East Side's elite families. Her reputation for discretion was absolute, her pediatric credentials impeccable, her ability to handle difficult situations legendary among the wealthy families who required such specialized care. "Mr. Santoro," she said, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had learned to navigate powerful personalities without surrendering her own authority. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night. The outside consultation. Dr. Clara Wynne. I know her by reputation, pediatric medicine, experience with complex cases, someone who thinks beyond conventional diagnoses. She's agreed to examine Milo, but there are conditions." Matteo's eyebrows rose slightly. In his world, he set conditions. Others accepted them. "She wants full access to medical records, complete freedom to ask questions, and the right to involve additional specialists if necessary. She also wants to speak with everyone who has direct contact with Milo, family, staff, medical personnel, and in exchange. She'll treat this as an emergency consultation. No publicity, no official records, complete confidentiality. But Mr. Santoro—" Camilla hesitated, then forged ahead with the kind of professional courage that had earned his respect. "She's going to ask difficult questions, about routines, about access, about everyone in this household. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Matteo considered the question with the same analytical precision he applied to corporate strategy. Scrutiny meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous in his world. But Milo's life hung in the balance, and for the first time in his adult life, protecting something he loved mattered more than protecting his position. "Arrange it," he said. "Full access, complete cooperation. But Camilla—" His voice dropped to the tone he used when issuing orders that weren't open to interpretation. "Dr. Wynne will be operating under our security protocols. Mikhail will brief her on expectations before she enters this house. She won't be intimidated." Good. If she were easily intimidated, she wouldn't be worth consulting. As Camilla returned to the nursery, Matteo remained in the hallway, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power that had defined his life since childhood. His father had built the foundation of their empire through calculated risks and ruthless execution. Matteo had expanded it by learning early that the world respected strength and punished weakness. But standing outside his son's room, listening to Camilla speak in soothing tones to a baby who wasn't thriving despite every advantage money could buy, he confronted a truth that threatened everything he thought he understood about control. Some battles couldn't be won through dominance or influence or careful planning. Some battles required something far more dangerous than power. They required trust. His phone buzzed again. Another crisis demanding his attention. Another decision that would affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. But Matteo Santoro, who had never met a problem he couldn't solve or an enemy he couldn't defeat, silenced the phone and walked into his son's nursery, where the only victory that mattered was measured in ounces gained and breaths taken without struggle. Tomorrow, Doctor, Clara Wynne would enter his carefully controlled world and threaten the security he had spent a lifetime building. Tonight, he sat beside Milo's crib and confronted the possibility that saving his son might require destroying everything else he had worked to protect. The Santoro mansion rose from East 70th Street like a fortress disguised as elegance. Clara stood before its limestone facade, her borrowed coat inadequate against the October wind that swept down from Central Park, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and old money. Security cameras tracked her movement from multiple angles, their mechanical eyes recording every detail of her approach. She had expected wealth. She hadn't expected militarization. The front entrance was flanked by two men in dark suits, whose stillness suggested professional training rather than ceremonial positioning. When Clara approached the intercom, one of them stepped forward with the fluid movement of someone accustomed to intercepting threats. "Dr. Clara Wynne," she said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "I'm expected." The man spoke into a device at his collar, received a response she couldn't hear, then gestured toward the door with the impersonal courtesy of someone following protocols. "Please step inside for security screening." The foyer overwhelmed her senses. Marble floors that reflected light like still water, a chandelier that could have illuminated a cathedral, artwork that belonged in museums. But Clara's attention was immediately drawn to the man who emerged from a side corridor with the predatory grace of someone who owned everything he surveyed. Mikhail Orlov was built like a monument to controlled violence. 6.5 feet of carefully tailored menace, his presence filling the space around him with an aura of barely contained threat. His accent, when he spoke, carried traces of Eastern Europe and expensive education. "Dr. Wynne, I am Mikhail Orlov, head of security for the Santoro family. Before you proceed, there are protocols that must be observed. I'm here to examine a sick child, not breach national security. In this house, those may be the same thing." His smile contained no warmth. "Your bag, please." The search was thorough and professional. Every item in her medical kit was examined, every pocket explored, every seam investigated. Clara submitted to the process with growing irritation, her focus on the urgency that had brought her here, rather than the theater of protection surrounding her. "Cell phone," Mikhail continued. "Recording capabilities will be disabled while you're in the building. Emergency calls only, monitored and recorded. That's not standard procedure, non-negotiable." She handed over her phone, watching him attach a device that presumably scrambled its functions. The systematic removal of her autonomy felt like preparation for imprisonment rather than medical consultation. "One final requirement," Mikhail said, producing a tablet from his jacket. "Non-disclosure agreement. Everything you see, hear, or learn in this house is confidential. Violation results in immediate legal action and permanent professional consequences." Clara read the document quickly, her medical training having prepared her for complex legal language. The agreement was comprehensive, binding, and utterly one-sided. Signing it would place her at the mercy of people who clearly didn't believe in mercy. "The baby upstairs is dying," she said, returning the tablet unsigned. "While we're playing security theater, he's losing weight and strength. I didn't come here to negotiate contracts, I came here to practice medicine." Mikhail's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something unexpected: concern. "Dr. Wynne, the child you're here to examine is the son of one of the most powerful men in America. The threats against this family are real, constant, and deadly. These protocols exist because you're afraid." Clara's voice cut through his explanation like a scalpel through tissue. "You have all this security, all this control, all this power, and you're still afraid. Because the one thing that matters most to Mr. Santoro is the one thing you can't protect." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Mikhail stood frozen, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something raw and desperate. In that moment, Clara saw past the intimidation and protocol to the truth underneath. This man, for all his professional competence, was terrified of failing to protect a child he cared about. "Where is Milo?" she asked softly. Before Mikhail could respond, footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Clara turned to see a man approaching with the measured pace of someone who had learned that every entrance was a performance. Matteo Santoro moved through his own foyer like a king surveying his kingdom, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power in the room. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with the kind of carefully maintained physique that spoke of discipline rather than vanity. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable, his eyes holding the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. But Clara had spent years reading the micro-expressions of worried parents, and beneath Matteo Santoro's controlled facade, she recognized desperate fear. "Dr. Wynne." His voice carried authority that had been shaped by boardrooms and courtrooms. "Thank you for coming. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Clara replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Your security chief seems to think I need permission to examine a sick child. Matteo glanced at Mikhail, some silent communication passing between them. The NDA tablet disappeared into the security chief's jacket. The protocols are for your protection as much as ours, Matteo said. People who enter this house become targets by association. Are you prepared for that consequence? Clara thought of Jade, alone in their Brooklyn apartment, researching experimental treatments for a disease that might kill her, before Clara found a way to pay for surgery. She thought of the children in Brooklyn General's emergency room, fighting illnesses with inadequate resources and overwhelmed staff. She thought of all the battles she had lost because she lacked the resources to win them. I'm prepared to save your son, she said. Everything else is negotiable. For the first time since entering the mansion, Clara saw something genuine in Matteo Santoro's expression, not the calculated mask of power, but the raw desperation of a father watching his child die. Mikhail will show you to the nursery, he said. You'll have complete access to everything. Medical records, staff, family members. Ask whatever questions you need to ask. And the NDA? Unnecessary. You're here because Camilla Reyes trusts you. That's enough for me. As they moved through corridors lined with artwork worth more than most people's homes, Clara felt the weight of what she had committed to. She was entering a world where her medical expertise was the only armor she possessed, where the stakes were measured not just in life and death, but in power and influence and consequences that extended far beyond one sick child. But in the nursery, when she first saw Milo Santoro, 10 months old, heartbreakingly beautiful, and wasting away despite every advantage money could provide, all the politics and protocol faded to background noise. Here was a child who needed her help. Everything else would have to wait. The nursery existed in a bubble of engineered perfection that felt more like a medical facility than a child's room. Clara moved through her examination with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle on Milo's small body, while her mind catalogued everything that didn't add up. The baby was indeed failing to thrive, his muscle tone poor, his responses sluggish, but the clinical presentation suggested malnutrition rather than disease. He's been seen by 12 specialists in 3 weeks, Camilla said, handing Clara a thick folder of medical records. Every test imaginable, every scan available. Nothing definitive. Clara studied the lab results, imaging studies and consultation notes with growing concern. The medical workup was comprehensive and expensive, but it was also focused on finding rare diseases rather than considering simpler explanations. Sometimes the most obvious answer was the correct one, even when it pointed toward something no one wanted to acknowledge. I need to see his feeding schedule, Clara said. Everything, times, amounts, who prepares bottles, who administers them, and I want to review security footage from the nursery. Matteo, who had been standing silently in the doorway, stepped forward. Security footage is restricted. Then unrestrict it. You asked me to find out what's wrong with your son. I can't do that with limited information. The tension in the room was palpable. Clara could feel Matteo weighing her request against considerations she couldn't begin to understand. Family privacy, business secrets, personal vulnerabilities that powerful men spent fortunes to protect. 1 week, he said finally. You'll have full access to everything for 1 week. Security footage, staff schedules, medical records, family routines. In exchange, you'll live here during that time. No leaving the premises without approval. No outside communication except emergencies. No discussing anything you observe with anyone outside this house. Clara looked up from Milo's chart. You want me to move in? The guest suite on the 3rd floor has been prepared. Mikhail will provide you with approved communication devices. All meals will be provided. You'll have a security detail when you leave your room. A security detail or surveillance? Both. The offer hung between them like a contract written in invisible ink. Clara understood what Matteo was proposing, complete immersion in his world in exchange for complete submission to his control. She would have access to everything she needed to help Milo, but she would also become a prisoner in a golden cage. And my life outside this house, my job, my responsibilities? Your supervisor at Brooklyn General has been contacted. You're on emergency medical leave, fully compensated. Any personal obligations will be handled by my staff." Clara's blood chilled. What personal obligations? Mateo's expression remained neutral, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what card he was playing. "Miss Jade Rodriguez, kidney failure, dialysis 3 times per week, currently on the transplant waiting list. Dr. Martinez at NYU has been contacted about expediting her case evaluation." The folder of medical records slipped from Clara's hands, pages scattering across the nursery floor. "How do you—" "Dr. Wynne, I don't make agreements without understanding all variables. Your dedication to Miss Rodriguez is admirable, but it's also a vulnerability. Accept my terms, and her medical care becomes my responsibility. Refuse, and you return to Brooklyn with nothing resolved, for my son or for her." Clara knelt to gather the scattered papers, her hands shaking with a combination of fury and desperate hope. Mateo Santoro had just offered her everything she needed to save both children she cared about most. He had also demonstrated that her privacy, her autonomy, her entire life existed only at his discretion. "You investigated me. I protect what's mine. You're asking for access to my family, my home, my most vulnerable moments. Did you think I would grant that without knowing exactly who you are?" Camilla cleared her throat softly. "Dr. Wynne, if it helps, I can tell you that Mr. Santoro's word is absolute. When he promises protection, he delivers it. And when he promises consequences, he delivers those too." Clara looked down at Milo, who had fallen asleep during her examination. In the soft lighting of the nursery, he looked like any other baby, peaceful, innocent, deserving of every chance to thrive. But she could feel his ribs beneath her fingers, could see the shadows under his eyes that spoke of slow starvation. "The security footage," she said. "All of it, from the past month." "Agreed. Complete access to staff records, schedules, background checks." "Agreed. And I want to interview everyone who has contact with Milo. Family, household staff, medical personnel. No restrictions, no supervision." Mateo hesitated. Clara could see him calculating risks, weighing the cost of transparency against the value of his son's life. "Agreed, but Dr. Wynne—" His voice carried a warning that made the air in the room feel heavier. "What you discover in this house stays in this house. Some secrets are dangerous to know." Clara met his gaze directly. "I'm not afraid of dangerous secrets. I'm afraid of children dying from preventable causes." "Then we understand each other." Mikhail appeared in the doorway as if summoned by telepathy. "The guest suite is prepared. Security protocols are in effect immediately." As Clara gathered her things, she felt the weight of the choice she had just made. She was trading her freedom for the chance to save 2 lives, accepting protection that felt more like elegant captivity. The golden cage was closing around her, but inside it lay the answers she needed and the resources to act on them. "Dr. Wynne," Mateo said as she reached the door, "my son's life is in your hands now. Don't disappoint me." Clara turned back to look at him, this man who commanded empires and bent the world to his will, who was now reduced to placing his most precious possession in the hands of a stranger. "I've never met a case I couldn't solve," she said. "I don't intend to start with yours." As Mikhail escorted her to the guest suite, Clara understood that she had just entered a world where the stakes were higher than anything in her previous experience. But she had also gained access to resources that could change everything, for Milo, for Jade, and for her own understanding of what she was capable of when the alternative was losing everything that mattered. The cage was golden, but the key to solving this mystery lay somewhere inside it. The guest suite occupied an entire floor of what had once been a Manhattan townhouse, now seamlessly integrated into the Santoro family compound. Clara stood at floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park, watching early morning joggers navigate paths that wound between ancient trees. From this height, the city looked manageable, orderly, contained, an illusion that money and elevation could create. Her new accommodations were a study in understated luxury: Italian marble in the bathroom, Egyptian cotton linens, a sitting area furnished with pieces that belonged in design magazines. Everything was perfect, expensive and utterly impersonal. It was like living inside a high-end hotel where she was simultaneously guest and prisoner. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Elisa Moreno entered carrying a breakfast tray, her young face bright with nervous energy. "Dr. Wynne, I brought coffee and pastries. Mr. Santoro thought you might want to eat before beginning your work today." "Thank you, Elisa, and please call me Clara." She gestured toward the small dining table. "Join me. I'd like to talk to you about Milo." Elisa hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting surveillance. "I'm supposed to be preparing for the morning feeding schedule." "This is part of my work. Sit." The young woman perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready for flight. Clara poured coffee from an elegant silver service and noted how Elisa's hands trembled slightly when she accepted the cup. "How long have you worked for the family?" 3 weeks, since just before Milo started getting worse." Elisa's voice carried a slight accent that spoke of careful English learned through necessity rather than privilege. "I was hired through an agency. Background checks, references, medical screening. They investigated my entire life. Tell me about the household routine. Who has access to the nursery?" "Family members, of course. Mr. Santoro, Mrs. Celeste, Camilla during her nursing shifts, me during designated care times. The housekeeping staff has limited access for cleaning, always supervised." Elisa paused, her expression troubled. "But Dr. Wynne, Clara, something isn't right about the feeding schedule." "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Celeste insists on handling the midnight feeding herself, every night without exception. She says it's bonding time, but—" Elisa set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "Milo is always fussy afterward. Stomach problems, crying, disrupted sleep. When I feed him during my shifts, he's calm." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "Have you mentioned this to anyone?" "I tried to tell Camilla, but she said Mrs. Celeste is the mother, and mothers have intuitive knowledge about their babies." Elisa's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I don't think Mrs. Celeste likes being a mother." Before Clara could respond, the door opened without a knock. Matteo entered with the quiet authority of someone who owned everything around him, including the people in it. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, making the luxurious suite feel smaller and more confining. "Elisa, you're needed in the kitchen," he said, his tone polite but unmistakably dismissive. The young woman stood quickly, avoiding eye contact. "Yes, sir. Dr. Wynne. Thank you for the coffee." After Elisa left, Clara found herself alone with Matteo for the first time since agreeing to his terms. In the morning light streaming through the windows, she could see details that had been obscured by the mansion's dramatic lighting, the tension lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the expensive watch that probably cost more than her annual salary. "For your questioning my staff," he said, settling into the chair Elisa had vacated. "I'm gathering information. That's what you're paying me to do." "I'm not paying you. I'm protecting you. There's a difference." Clara set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Let's be clear about our arrangement. You need me to find out what's wrong with your son. I need access to information and people. Don't mistake cooperation for submission." Something flickered in Matteo's expression, surprise perhaps, or approval. "Most people in your position would be more diplomatic. Most people in my position haven't spent years fighting hospital bureaucracies for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. And most people don't have someone they love dying while they're locked away in a stranger's house." The reminder of Jade hit Clara like cold water. She had called the night before, using the monitored phone Mikhail provided, and learned that Jade's condition remained stable but precarious. The promised consultation at NYU was scheduled for the end of the week, contingent, she knew without being told, on her continued cooperation. "You're very good at finding pressure points," Clara said. "I have to be. But Dr. Wynne, Clara, I want you to understand something." Matteo leaned forward, his expression intense. "Everything I'm doing, every restriction I'm placing on you, every precaution that feels like imprisonment, it's because threats against my family are real and constant. 3 months ago, there was an attempt to kidnap Milo from his pediatrician's office. 6 months before that, someone tried to poison Celeste at a charity gala. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You didn't mention that when you offered me this arrangement. Would you have refused if I had?" The honest answer was no, and they both knew it. Jade's need for medical intervention trumped almost every other consideration, including Clara's personal safety. "I want to review the security footage now," Clara said. "All of it, starting from when Milo's symptoms first appeared. Mikhail is setting up a viewing room, but Clara—" Matteo stood, his movement precise and controlled. "What you're about to see will change how you think about this family. Some things once known can't be unknown. I'm not afraid of difficult truths. You should be. In this house, difficult truths have a way of becoming dangerous secrets." After he left, Clara remained at the window, watching the city wake up far below. The luxury surrounding her was undeniable. Silk curtains, hand-carved furniture, artwork that probably belonged in museums. But luxury without freedom was still a prison, regardless of how beautiful the bars might be. Her reflection stared back from the window glass, superimposed over the park view like a ghost haunting paradise. She looked tired, out of place, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But her eyes held something that wealth couldn't buy and power couldn't break. Determination forged in Brooklyn emergency rooms and tempered by the knowledge that 2 children's lives depended on her ability to solve an impossible puzzle. The golden cage was closing around her, but Clara had never learned to accept cages gracefully. If Matteo Santoro thought protection meant compliance, he was about to discover how wrong he could be. The security viewing room existed in the mansion's basement, a windowless space lined with monitors and servers that hummed with electronic vigilance. Clara sat before a wall of screens displaying feeds from every angle of the nursery, while Mikhail operated controls with the practiced efficiency of someone who lived his life through surveillance technology. "Cameras record continuously," he explained, his accent softer in the artificial light. "Motion detection, audio enhancement, night vision capability. Nothing happens in this house without documentation." "Except," Clara observed, reviewing timestamp logs, "the nursery cameras go offline every night between midnight and 2 a.m. Mikhail's fingers paused over the keyboard. Scheduled maintenance, system backup, and memory defragmentation. Convenient timing, right when Mrs. Santoro does the midnight feeding. Mrs. Santoro values privacy during intimate moments with her son." Clara turned to study Mikhail's profile. In the weeks she'd been observing the household staff, she had learned to read the subtle tells that indicated when someone was lying. Mikhail wasn't lying exactly, but he was omitting something significant. "Show me the footage from 3 weeks ago. The night before Milo's symptoms became obvious." The screens flickered to life with images of the nursery bathed in soft nighttime lighting. Clara watched Celeste Santoro move through her son's room with the careful precision of someone following a script rather than maternal instinct. There was something performative about her movements, as if she was aware of being observed, even in supposedly private moments. "There," Clara said, pointing to a timestamp. "She's carrying something that's not in the baby bottle preparation routine." Mikhail enhanced the image, but the resolution wasn't sufficient to identify the object in Celeste's hand. Could be anything. Pacifier, toy, medication. Or it could be the reason Milo is failing to thrive. The door opened without warning, admitting Matteo with the silent authority that preceded him everywhere. In the basement's artificial environment, removed from the natural light and spacious elegance of his public spaces, he seemed more human, tired, worried, diminished by circumstances beyond his control. "Find anything useful?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Clara. "Your wife maintains very regular habits. Same time every night, same routine, same mysterious object that doesn't appear in any other feeding sequence." "Mysterious object?" Clara replayed the enhanced footage, pointing to the shadow in Celeste's hand. "Something small, portable, that she doesn't want documented. The cameras conveniently malfunction during her midnight visits." Matteo's expression hardened. Celeste requested the privacy protocol. She said constant surveillance made her feel like a prisoner in her own home. "And you agreed?" "She's my wife and the mother of my son. Some level of trust is necessary." Clara turned to face him directly. "Mr. Santoro, Matteo, in my experience, when children are failing to thrive in wealthy households, the cause is rarely accidental. Someone in this house is making your son sick. The question is whether it's intentional or the result of well-meaning incompetence. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Mikhail's hands stilled on the keyboard, and Clara could feel the sudden tension that came with speaking truths that powerful people preferred to avoid. You're suggesting someone is poisoning my son. I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities, including the ones that are hardest to accept. Matteo was quiet for a long moment, studying the frozen image of his wife on the security monitor. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions that had been building for weeks. Celeste has been different since Milo was born. Distant, mechanical, like she's playing a role rather than living it. I attributed it to postpartum adjustment, hormonal changes, the pressure of new motherhood. Has she expressed any concerns about your marriage? Feelings of neglect or abandonment? Why would she? She has everything anyone could want. Security, luxury, status, a beautiful child. Clara heard the genuine confusion in his voice and recognized it as the blindness that often afflicted powerful men. They understood corporate politics and financial leverage, but the emotional needs of the people closest to them remained mysterious. Sometimes, Clara said carefully, people who have everything still feel like they have nothing, especially when the person they love most seems unreachable. Matteo looked at her sharply. You think I'm unreachable? I think you're a man who spent his life learning that showing vulnerability is dangerous. But your wife may interpret your strength as emotional absence. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from one of the monitors. The nursery camera showed Celeste entering Milo's room for the afternoon feeding, her movements precise and careful. Clara watched intently, noting the slight hesitation before Celeste picked up the prepared bottle. The way her eyes avoided the security camera, the tension in her shoulders that suggested someone performing under scrutiny. I want to test everything, Clara said. Every bottle, every food preparation, every medication. I want lab analysis of anything that goes into your son's body. Done. And I want to interview Celeste, alone without preparation or coaching. This time Matteo hesitated. That's complicated. Because you don't trust me with your wife? Or because you don't trust your wife with me? The question forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. Clara could see the internal struggle, the husband who wanted to protect his wife's privacy, the father who needed to protect his son's life, the powerful man who was accustomed to controlling every variable, but found himself helpless against an enemy he couldn't identify. 1 hour, he said finally. Supervised, but I won't interfere unless necessary. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Matteo stood, his movement sharp with barely contained tension. If you're right about Celeste, you're going to destroy my family. If you're wrong, you're going to damage relationships that may never recover. And if I do nothing, your son dies. The stark simplicity of the choice settled over them like dust. Mikhail continued reviewing footage with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to finding needles in electronic haystacks, but Clara could feel his attention divided between the screens and the conversation unfolding beside him. Clara, Matteo said, and she noticed he was using her first name without the formal distance he usually maintained. I need you to understand something. This house, this family, this entire world I've built, it exists because I learned early that trust is a luxury I couldn't afford. But right now my son's life depends on my ability to trust you completely. I know. Do you? Because what I'm about to ask requires more than professional competence. It requires faith that you'll use the power I'm giving you to heal rather than destroy. Clara met his gaze directly. I've never met a case I couldn't solve, but I've also never solved a case by avoiding difficult truths. If you want me to save Milo, you have to be prepared for me to uncover secrets you'd prefer to keep hidden. Matteo nodded slowly. Then let's find out what my wife is hiding. The interview with Celeste Santoro took place in the mansion's formal library, a room designed to intimidate with its towering shelves of leather-bound volumes and portraits of stern ancestors. Clara had chosen the setting deliberately, neutral territory that belonged neither to the nursery's intimacy nor the family's private spaces, somewhere that might encourage honesty through its very formality. Celeste entered with the practiced grace of someone who had learned early that every appearance was a performance. At 28, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that expensive stylists and personal trainers could create, but Clara noticed the signs that money couldn't disguise: the slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she avoided direct eye contact, the tension around her mouth that suggested secrets held too tightly for too long. "Mrs. Santoro, thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Clara began, settling into a wing-back chair across from where Celeste perched on the edge of a silk-upholstered sofa. "Matteo said it was necessary." Celeste's voice carried the studied neutrality of someone who had learned to give answers without revealing information. "Though I'm not sure what I can tell you that the doctors haven't already discovered. Sometimes mothers notice things that medical professionals miss. You spend more time with Milo than anyone else." "Do I?" Celeste's laugh held no humor. "Between the nurses, the babysitters, the security protocols, sometimes I feel like a visitor in my own son's life." Clara heard something genuine beneath the practiced complaint, a note of real resentment that suggested deeper issues than postpartum adjustment. "Tell me about the midnight feedings. Why did you choose to handle those yourself?" "Bonding time." The response came too quickly, too rehearsed. The pediatric books all emphasize the importance of consistent maternal contact during feeding schedules. But Milo seems to have digestive issues after those particular feedings. Celeste's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "Babies have sensitive stomachs, gas, colic, growth spurts. There could be dozens of explanations." "True, but the pattern is very specific. Only after your midnight feedings, never during the day when Camilla or Elisa handle his care." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of the library's antique clock, marking time with mechanical precision. Celeste sat motionless, her carefully manicured fingers gripping the sofa arm with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "Are you suggesting I'm doing something wrong?" she asked finally. "I'm trying to understand why your son is failing to thrive despite having access to the best possible care." Before Celeste could respond, Mikhail appeared in the doorway with the silent urgency that meant immediate crisis. "Dr. Wynne, Mr. Santoro needs you upstairs, now." Clara found Matteo in his private office, surrounded by computer screens displaying news feeds and financial data. His expression was grimmer than she had ever seen it, his usual controlled composure replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "What's happened?" she asked. "Someone leaked information about your investigation." He gestured toward one of the monitors, where a gossip website displayed a headline that made Clara's blood run cold. "Billionaire's baby mystery. Inside sources reveal medical crisis in Santoro household." Clara scanned the article with growing horror. While it didn't mention her by name, it contained details that could only have come from someone with inside access. Milo's symptoms, the multiple hospital consultations, even references to suspicious circumstances surrounding his condition. How many people knew about my investigation? Household staff, security personnel, family members, maybe a dozen people total, any of whom could have sold information to the press. Matteo's phone rang with the insistent tone reserved for urgent calls. He answered without taking his eyes off the newsfeed. "Santoro." His expression darkened further. "When?" A pause. "Double security immediately. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization." "What now?" Clara asked as he ended the call. "Gregor Markovich." The name carried weight that Clara didn't understand but could feel in the sudden tension that filled the room. Celeste's father. "He's requesting an immediate meeting to discuss his daughter's welfare." That sounds reasonable for a concerned grandfather. Gregor Markovich doesn't make social calls. He's the head of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Eastern Europe, and he considers any threat to his daughter a personal attack on his family. Clara felt the world shift around her as implications cascaded through her understanding. Celeste is connected to organized crime. Her father is. She cut ties when we married, but blood relationships don't disappear because of wedding vows. Matteo began pacing with the restless energy of a caged predator. Here if he thinks I'm allowing his daughter to be publicly humiliated or accused of harming her own child. He'll what? He'll remind me why crossing the Markovich family is traditionally a fatal mistake. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of electronic equipment. Clara found herself re-evaluating everything she thought she understood about the Santoro household. The security measures that had seemed excessive now appeared barely adequate. The isolation that had felt like imprisonment now felt like protection. "The leak," she said slowly. "What if it wasn't about money? What if someone wanted to force this confrontation?" Matteo stopped pacing. "Explain. Think about it. Someone with access to internal information releases details that are guaranteed to attract Markovich's attention and force him to intervene. Either they're trying to protect Celeste from investigation, or they're using the situation to destabilize your family. You think we have a traitor in the household. I think we have someone who's playing a much more complex game than simple information selling." Matteo's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message. He read it quickly, his expression growing darker. "Markovich will be here in 2 hours. He's bringing security. What does that mean for my investigation?" "It means you have 2 hours to find proof of what's happening to Milo, or you become collateral damage in a war that started before you were born." Clara felt the weight of the timeline crushing down on her. 2 hours to solve a mystery that had been building for weeks, to find evidence that might implicate a powerful man's daughter, to navigate between competing loyalties and dangerous secrets. "I need to test everything immediately," she said. "Every bottle, every food preparation, anything that goes near Milo. And I need access to Celeste's personal belongings." Dangerous territory. Everything about this situation is dangerous territory. But that baby upstairs is running out of time, and now it sounds like we are too. Matteo nodded grimly. "Mikhail will provide whatever you need. But Clara..." He met her eyes with an intensity that made her understand exactly how precarious their position had become. "When Gregor Markovich arrives, you become invisible. Whatever you've discovered, whatever you suspect, you keep it to yourself until this meeting is over. And if what I discover implicates his daughter, then we better hope you're wrong. Because if you're right, proving it might be the last thing either of us ever does." As Clara hurried from the office, her mind racing through possibilities and evidence, she understood that the investigation had shifted from medical mystery to survival exercise. Someone in this house was playing a deadly game, and she had become an unwitting piece on a board where the wrong move could cost everything. The mansion's main drawing room had been transformed into a stage for confrontation. Gregor Markovich arrived precisely on schedule, his presence preceded by a security detail that made Matteo's own protection seem modest by comparison. Clara watched from the second-floor landing, hidden behind marble columns but close enough to observe the careful choreography of power meeting power. Markovich himself defied her expectations. Rather than the stereotypical criminal patriarch, he appeared as a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. But Clara noticed how the household staff avoided eye contact, how even Mikhail's usually steady composure showed cracks of tension. "Matteo." Markovich's accent was cultured, his English precise. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. Gregor, you're always welcome in my home." The formality between the two men crackled with undercurrents that Clara couldn't fully decipher. They spoke like diplomats negotiating a ceasefire, each word carefully chosen to avoid triggering a larger conflict. "I've come about the news reports concerning my daughter and grandson. Unfounded speculation by irresponsible media. Perhaps, but speculation becomes reality when it affects family reputation. My daughter's honor is not a subject for public entertainment." Clara watched Celeste during this exchange, noting how she stood apart from both men, her posture suggesting someone caught between competing loyalties. When Markovich's attention turned to her, she approached with the subdued manner of a child summoned before a stern parent. "Papa, there's been a misunderstanding. The doctor is simply being thorough." "The doctor," Markovich interrupted, his voice carrying new steel, "is a stranger who has been granted access to private family matters. I question the wisdom of such openness." Clara felt the weight of his words like a physical threat. From her hidden position, she could see how the room's atmosphere had shifted. Security personnel on both sides maintaining careful distance. household staff finding urgent business elsewhere, the very air seeming to thicken with potential violence. "Dr. Wynne is helping us find answers," Matteo said, his tone carefully neutral. "Milo's health requires expert consultation." "And what answers has she found?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring. Clara realized that Markovich already knew more than he was revealing, possibly everything about her investigation, her suspicions, her growing certainty that someone in this household was systematically poisoning a 10-month-old baby. "The investigation is ongoing," Matteo replied. "How unfortunate, because I've conducted my own inquiries, and the results are disturbing." Markovich gestured to one of his men, who produced a tablet displaying what appeared to be surveillance photographs. From her position, Clara couldn't see the images clearly, but she watched the blood drain from Matteo's face as he reviewed them. "Where did you get these?" "I have friends in many places. The question is whether you've been entirely honest with me about the circumstances surrounding my grandson's illness." Clara's phone vibrated against her hip, a message from the laboratory where she'd sent samples of Milo's feeding materials for emergency analysis. She read the text with growing horror. "High concentrations of stimulant laxatives detected. Dosage levels dangerous for infant consumption. Recommend immediate medical intervention." She had her proof, but proving Celeste's guilt in front of her criminal father would be like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. The conversation below had taken on a more dangerous tone. Markovich was speaking in measured phrases that carried implications Clara could feel even without understanding the specific threats. "Unfortunate incidents have occurred when family loyalty is questioned. Misunderstandings can escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Protection requires decisive action against those who would harm what we cherish most." Clara realized she was witnessing something far more complex than a grandfather's concern. This was a power struggle disguised as family diplomacy, with her investigation as the catalyst threatening to expose secrets that multiple parties wanted to keep buried. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Mikhail. "Need you downstairs. Bring lab results. Now." Clara understood she was being summoned into the lion's den. Whatever game was being played, her role had shifted from investigator to key witness in a confrontation that could determine not just Milo's fate, but her own survival. She descended the marble staircase with measured steps, her medical bag containing the laboratory evidence that would either solve this case or sign her death warrant. The drawing room fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning to assess this new variable in their carefully balanced equation of threats and counter-threats. "Dr. Wynne." Markovich's voice was silk over steel. "How convenient. I was just discussing your work with my son-in-law." "Mr. Markovich." Clara kept her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I understand you're concerned about your grandson's welfare. Among other things, tell me, what professional opinion have you formed about the cause of Milo's condition?" The question was a trap designed to force her into revealing information that could destroy Celeste, humiliate Matteo, or provide Markovich with ammunition for purposes she couldn't begin to imagine. But Clara had spent years navigating hospital politics and medical ethics boards, learning when to speak truth to power and when to choose her words like a surgeon choosing instruments. "I've identified the cause," she said carefully, "but the solution requires delicate handling to protect everyone involved." "How delicate?" "Delicate enough to require privacy for all concerned parties." Markovich studied her with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. The silence stretched until Clara could hear the antique clock marking time, each tick echoing like a countdown to some inevitable explosion. "Very well," he said finally. "We will discuss this matter privately. But Dr. Wynne..." His smile contained no warmth. "In my family, we take great care of those who help us. We also take great care of those who betray our trust. I trust you understand the distinction." Clara nodded, knowing she had just been given both promise and warning. The investigation had reached its crisis point, and her next move would determine whether she emerged as hero or victim in a story where the stakes had escalated far beyond one sick child. The drawing room emptied slowly, leaving Clara alone with her knowledge and the terrible responsibility of deciding how to use it. The private meeting took place in Mateo's study, a fortress of mahogany and leather that had witnessed decades of family decisions. Clara sat across from Gregor Markovich, acutely aware that Mateo remained standing, a position that suggested he was as much prisoner as host in this conversation. "Show me your evidence," Markovich said without preamble. Clara placed the laboratory report on the desk between them. High concentrations of stimulant laxatives in feeding materials, dosage levels that would cause severe digestive distress in an infant, leading to malnutrition and failure to thrive. Markovich read the document with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating intelligence reports. His expression revealed nothing, but Clara noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the information wasn't entirely surprising. "Interesting," he said finally. "And your conclusion about the source of this contamination? The evidence points to deliberate introduction during specific feeding times, the midnight schedule handled exclusively by Mrs. Santoro." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that reached every corner. Mateo's face went white, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something raw and broken underneath. "So you're accusing my wife of poisoning our son. I'm presenting evidence that requires explanation." "Evidence that conveniently supports certain preconceptions," Markovich interjected, his voice carrying new menace. "How curious that a stranger arrives in this house and immediately suspects the one person who has devoted her life to her child's welfare." Clara felt the conversation shifting around her like quicksand. The laboratory results are objective. They don't lie. Perhaps not, but laboratories can be influenced, results can be manufactured, and accusations can be weaponized by those with hidden agendas. "What are you suggesting?" Markovich stood, his movement precise and controlled. "I'm suggesting that someone wanted my daughter implicated in this situation, someone who benefits from destroying her reputation and destabilizing this family." He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back in the pose of someone delivering a prepared speech. "Tell me, Dr. Wynne, who arranged for your involvement in this case? Who provided your contact information to the household staff? Who ensured you would have access to evidence that implicates my daughter?" Clara's mind raced through the sequence of events: Elisa's call, Camilla's recommendation, the convenient access to testing materials, the laboratory results that arrived precisely when needed to support her suspicions. "You think I'm part of some conspiracy. I think you're a useful tool being manipulated by someone far more sophisticated than a desperate pediatrician from Brooklyn." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked at Mateo, expecting support or at least skepticism about his father-in-law's theory. Instead, she saw doubt creeping into his expression, the careful re-evaluation of someone who had survived by questioning everyone and everything. "Mateo, you can't seriously believe." "I don't know what to believe." His voice carried the weight of a man whose world was collapsing around him. 3 weeks ago, my son was healthy. You arrive, and suddenly we have evidence of poisoning that implicates my wife. Evidence that happens to surface just as external threats against my family intensify. "The timing is suspicious," Markovich agreed, "but the solution is simple. Remove the disruptive element and see if the problems resolve themselves." Clara felt the walls closing in around her. The golden cage that had once offered protection was becoming a trap, and the man who had promised to safeguard her was now looking at her like a threat to be neutralized. "You're asking me to ignore evidence of child abuse because it's politically inconvenient. I'm asking you to consider that you may have been used as an unwitting weapon against an innocent woman. And Milo, what about his health while you protect family reputation?" Mateo moved to his desk, his movements sharp with barely controlled emotion. When he looked at Clara, she saw something that chilled her more than Markovich's overt threats: disappointment. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "Mikhail will escort you out within the hour." "You're dismissing me. I'm protecting my family from further damage." Clara stood, her medical bag clutched like armor against the accusations swirling around her. "And if I'm right? If Celeste is systematically poisoning your son and you're sending away the only person who identified the problem, then I'll live with the consequences of choosing loyalty over suspicion." The finality in his voice was absolute. Clara looked between the two men, the father protecting his daughter's honor, the husband choosing family solidarity over uncomfortable truth, and understood that her investigation had become collateral damage in a war she didn't fully comprehend. "I need to call my friend," she said. "Jade. I need to know she's safe." Matteo's expression flickered. "Of course. Mikhail will provide—" "No," Clara's voice cut through his offer like a blade. "I'll use my own phone outside this house, away from your monitoring and protection and manipulation." She moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. "When Milo gets worse, and he will, remember that you chose politics over medicine. Remember that you had answers and threw them away because they weren't convenient." Markovich's voice followed her into the hallway. "Dr. Wynne, for your own safety, I suggest you forget everything you've learned in this house. Some knowledge is dangerous to possess." Clara climbed the marble staircase to her guest suite, her mind reeling from the sudden reversal. Hours ago, she had been close to solving the case that would save Milo's life and secure Jade's future. Now she was being expelled as a potential threat, her evidence dismissed, her motives questioned. As she packed her few belongings, Clara's phone rang. Jade's voice carried across the distance like a lifeline. "Clara, you sound terrible. What's happening?" "I think I just lost everything," Clara said, sinking onto the bed that had briefly felt like sanctuary. "And I'm not sure I was wrong or right, or just incredibly naive. Come home, we'll figure it out together." But as Clara prepared to leave the Santoro mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was abandoning a 10-month-old baby to the very person who was slowly killing him. The golden cage was opening, but the price of freedom might be higher than she could bear to pay. The Brooklyn apartment felt impossibly small after 3 weeks in the Santoro mansion. Clara stood in the narrow kitchen, making coffee with hands that shook from exhaustion and frustration, while Jade watched her with the careful attention of someone evaluating a patient's mental state. "You look like hell," Jade said from her position on the couch, surrounded by medical journals and her laptop. "And you've been pacing for 2 hours." "I left a baby to die." Clara's voice was flat, drained of the professional confidence that had carried her through years of emergency medicine. "I had proof, I had answers, and I let them convince me I was wrong." "Were you?" The question forced Clara to examine what she knew versus what she suspected. The laboratory evidence was solid. Dangerous levels of laxatives in Milo's feeding materials. The timing pattern was clear. Symptoms appeared only after Celeste's midnight feedings. But Markovich's accusations had planted seeds of doubt that grew in the silence of her exile. "I don't know anymore. Maybe I was so desperate to solve the case that I saw patterns that weren't there. Maybe the contamination was accidental, environmental, something I missed because I wanted a villain to blame. Or maybe," Jade said carefully, "a powerful man convinced you to doubt your own expertise because the truth was inconvenient for his family." Clara's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Unknown number, which usually meant debt collectors or telemarketers. She almost ignored it. But something made her answer. "Dr. Wynne, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from NYU Langone. I've been treating your friend Jade Rodriguez." Clara's heart rate spiked. "Is she all right?" "She's stable, but I'm calling about something else. Mr. Santoro's office contacted us about expediting her transplant evaluation. The full workup has been scheduled for tomorrow, and we've been authorized to explore experimental treatment options that weren't previously covered." "I don't understand." "Neither did I, initially, but the authorization came with a note that the arrangements should continue regardless of your current employment status with the Santoro family. Dr. Wynne, I don't know what you did for this man, but he's ensuring your friend receives the absolute best care available." After ending the call, Clara stared at her phone with growing confusion. Matteo had dismissed her, questioned her motives, chosen family loyalty over her evidence. But he was still honoring his commitment to Jade's medical care, even though their agreement had been dissolved. "What was that about?" Jade asked. "Matteo Santoro is still paying for your treatment, even though he threw me out of his house." "Interesting. Doesn't sound like someone who thinks you're a fraud or a threat." Before Clara could respond, her phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a name that made her pulse quicken. Camilla Reyes. "Camilla, what's happening?" "Clara, thank God you answered." Camilla's voice was strained. Urgent? Milo is worse. Much worse. Whatever Mrs. Celeste gave him last night, it was stronger than before. He's dehydrated, listless, barely responsive. Have you told Mateo? He's not here. Business trip to Chicago, won't be back until tomorrow. And Mrs. Celeste, she's acting strange. Nervous, agitated, like she knows something's wrong but can't stop herself. Clara gripped the phone tighter. Where's Markovich? Gone, left this morning with his security detail, but Clara, that's not why I'm calling. What do you mean? I found something. Hidden in Mrs. Celeste's bedroom, a bottle of concentrated laxative powder nearly empty. And there's more. Camilla's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I installed a hidden camera in the nursery, one that can't be disabled by the scheduled maintenance protocol. Clara felt her world shift back into focus. You have footage? From last night, everything. The powder being mixed into the bottle, Mrs. Celeste feeding Milo, even audio of her talking to him while he gets sick. Camilla, you have to get that evidence to... To who? Mr. Santoro is gone. Markovich's people could still be watching. And if Mrs. Celeste realizes what I've done... The fear in Camilla's voice was palpable. Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Don't trust anyone else with this. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop on 86th and Lexington. Bring everything, the footage, the bottle, any other evidence you've collected. Clara, if they find out you're still investigating, let me worry about that. Just promise me you'll keep Milo safe until we can expose what's happening. I promise. After ending the call, Clara found Jade watching her with knowing eyes. You're going back, aren't you? Not to the mansion, but I'm not walking away from this case. Even though it nearly destroyed you. Clara considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she had been struggling to survive in Brooklyn General's underfunded emergency department, watching children suffer from preventable illnesses while drowning in her own financial desperation. The Santoro investigation had offered her a glimpse of resources beyond anything in her previous experience, and shown her how easily those resources could be weaponized against the truth. But it had also shown her something else. When she stood in that drawing room facing Markovich's threats and Mateo's doubt, when her professional reputation was being dismantled and her motives questioned, she hadn't backed down. She had spoken truth to power, even when that truth was inconvenient and dangerous. I spent years being invisible, Clara said, taking whatever cases were assigned, accepting whatever resources were available, never pushing too hard because I couldn't afford to lose my job. But this case, it reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. To save children, even when their families have more power than I can imagine, even when the truth is ugly and complicated and threatens people who could destroy me. Jade smiled despite her exhaustion. So what's the plan? I'm going to prove that Celeste Santoro is systematically poisoning her son, and then I'm going to make sure the evidence reaches someone who can't be intimidated or bought off. The police, child protective services, the media, if necessary, someone who cares more about a baby's life than family politics. Clara moved to the window that overlooked their neighborhood, gentrifying Brooklyn, caught between old poverty and new wealth, familiar in ways that the Upper East Side would never be. But she wasn't the same person who had left this apartment 3 weeks ago. The woman staring back from the window glass looked tired, battered by her encounter with power and privilege, but not defeated. She had learned something valuable in the golden cage of the Santoro mansion. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with resources or connections, but with the simple refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Tomorrow, she would begin the fight to save Milo Santoro's life. This time, she would fight it on her own terms. The coffee shop on 86th and Lexington occupied the ground floor of a pre-war building, its windows fogged with steam from the espresso machine and the breath of customers escaping October's bite. Clara arrived 20 minutes early, choosing a corner table with clear sight lines to both entrances, a precaution that felt paranoid until she remembered the forces arrayed against her investigation. Camilla appeared exactly on time, her usual professional composure replaced by the tense alertness of someone operating in hostile territory. She carried a leather messenger bag that she clutched like a lifeline, her eyes scanning the cafe for threats before settling into the chair across from Clara. "Thank you for coming," Clara said, noting the exhaustion etched around Camilla's eyes. "How is Milo this morning?" "Weak. The episode last night was severe. Prolonged cramping, dehydration, complete listlessness. I had to threaten to call 911 before Mrs. Celeste agreed to let me administer IV fluids." "She tried to stop medical intervention?" "She said hospitals would ask too many questions, that the family couldn't afford more publicity." Camilla's voice carried professional disgust. "Clara, I've worked pediatric cases for 15 years. I've never seen a mother more concerned about reputation than her child's welfare." Camilla opened her messenger bag with careful precision, producing a tablet computer and a small glass bottle wrapped in tissue paper. The bottle contained white powder residue that Clara recognized from the laboratory analysis. "Hidden in her jewelry box," Camilla explained. "Concentrated stimulant laxative, prescription strength. The dosage instructions on the label specify use for severe constipation in adults, completely inappropriate for infant consumption." Clara photographed the bottle from multiple angles, documenting the label and remaining contents. The evidence was damning, but she had learned that evidence alone wasn't enough when powerful families controlled the narrative. "Show me the footage." Camilla activated the tablet, revealing video from the hidden camera she had installed in Milo's nursery. The timestamp showed the previous night, 12:47 a.m. Clara watched with growing horror as Celeste Santoro entered the frame carrying a prepared bottle. But what chilled Clara most wasn't the mechanical way Celeste added powder to the formula. It was what happened afterward. As Milo struggled with the contaminated feeding, becoming increasingly distressed and uncomfortable, Celeste spoke to him in soft, soothing tones. "Mama's here, baby. Mama's taking care of you. Daddy doesn't understand how much you need me, but I do. When you're sick, you're mine. When you're healthy, you belong to everyone else." The audio was clear enough to capture every word, every inflection of misguided maternal devotion twisted into something monstrous. Clara felt sick, watching a mother rationalize poisoning her own child as an act of love. "There's more," Camilla said, advancing the timeline. "From this morning." The second video showed Matteo's return from his business trip. Clara watched him enter the nursery, his face transforming with alarm as he saw Milo's condition. The baby was pale, lethargic, clearly unwell, despite the luxury surrounding him. "What happened?" Matteo demanded, his voice sharp with panic. "Growth spurts can be difficult," Celeste replied smoothly. "The pediatric books mention that rapid development sometimes causes digestive sensitivity. This isn't a growth spurt. He looks like he's failing to thrive again. Perhaps we should consult Dr. Wynne." "Oh, wait. You dismissed her for being hysterical." The bitterness in Celeste's voice was unmistakable. Clara realized she was witnessing something beyond simple medical abuse. This was psychological warfare disguised as maternal care, with Milo as both weapon and victim. The cafe around them faded into background noise as Clara processed the implications. Celeste wasn't just poisoning her son randomly. She was creating crises that would force Matteo's attention, demonstrating her indispensability as the only person who could soothe their child's mysterious illness. "Camilla, this evidence needs to reach Child Protective Services immediately." "It's not that simple. The Santoro family has connections throughout the city's social services network. A complaint could be buried, evidence could disappear, and I could find myself unemployed and blacklisted." Clara understood the dilemma. Wealth insulated families from the kind of oversight that protected most children, creating blind spots where abuse could flourish unchecked. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She almost ignored it until she recognized the area code, Chicago, where Matteo was supposedly conducting business. "Dr. Wynne, this is Matteo Santoro." The sound of his voice sent unexpected emotions coursing through her: anger at his dismissal, relief that he was reaching out, fear that Markovich had somehow influenced this contact. "Mr. Santoro, I thought our professional relationship was terminated." "It was. This isn't a professional call." His voice carried an exhaustion that matched her own. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. When you presented evidence about Celeste, were you absolutely certain of your conclusions? Clara looked across the table at Camilla, who was watching with intense interest. The tablet displayed the frozen image of Celeste adding poison to her son's bottle, captured in digital clarity that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Yes, Clara said simply. Then I made a terrible mistake. The admission hung between them like a bridge extending across the chasm their last encounter had created. Clara could hear something in Mateo's voice that she hadn't heard before, vulnerability stripped of all pretense, the raw desperation of a father who had chosen wrong and knew it. Mateo, where are you calling from? O'Hare Airport. I'm flying back to New York immediately. Clara, I need your help. Not as an employee, not under any agreements or conditions. I'm asking you, as someone who cares about my son, to help me save him. What's changed? Everything. And nothing. I let fear override judgment, let politics replace truth. But Milo is worse, and I can't pretend anymore that dismissing you solved anything. Clara met Camilla's eyes across the table, seeing her own decision reflected there. The evidence they had gathered would either save a child's life or destroy them both. I'll help you, Clara said. But this time, we do it right. No more family loyalty protecting abuse. No more political considerations overriding medical facts. Agreed, whatever it takes. Then meet us at Brooklyn General in 2 hours. And Mateo, bring Milo. It's time to get him away from the person who's been slowly killing him. Brooklyn General's Pediatric Emergency Department had never seen security arrangements like those that accompanied Milo Santoro's arrival. Mikhail Orlov coordinated with hospital administration while maintaining discreet surveillance of all entrances, transforming the familiar chaos of the emergency room into something resembling a military operation. Clara met Mateo at the ambulance bay, noting immediately how the past 24 hours had aged him. His usual commanding presence was diminished by exhaustion and the helpless terror that came with watching his child deteriorate in real time. Milo looked worse than Clara had ever seen him. At 10 months old, he should have been active, curious, demanding attention with the relentless energy of healthy infancy. Instead, he lay motionless in Mateo's arms, his breathing shallow and his responses minimal. How long has he been this lethargic? Clara asked, leading them toward a private examination room. Since this morning. Celeste said it was normal post-feeding drowsiness, but Mateo's voice trailed off as Clara began her examination. The baby's vital signs were stable but concerning. Dehydrated, underweight, showing clear signs of chronic digestive distress. But more alarming than the physical symptoms was Milo's emotional state. He didn't track movement with his eyes, didn't reach for toys, or respond to voices the way a healthy infant should. This level of withdrawal suggests chronic stress response, Clara explained while documenting her findings. Prolonged pain and discomfort can cause developmental delays, emotional detachment, failure to bond normally with caregivers. You're saying the poisoning has affected his psychological development? I'm saying your son has learned that feeding time means pain. His lack of responsiveness is a survival mechanism. Clara's phone buzzed with a message from Camilla. Mrs. Celeste discovered missing bottle, extremely agitated, has called Mr. Markovich multiple times. We need to move quickly, Clara told Mateo. Celeste knows we have evidence. She'll try to control the narrative before we can present our case. What do you recommend? Full disclosure. Child Protective Services, District Attorney's Office, Family Court. Everything documented and filed simultaneously, so no single agency can suppress the investigation. Mateo nodded grimly. Do it. For the next hour, Clara coordinated what felt like a small military campaign. She contacted Dr. Sarah Chen at NYU for immediate backup documentation, reached out to Detective Maria Santos in the NYPD's Special Victims Unit, and prepared comprehensive medical records that would be impossible to dispute or dismiss. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Celeste Santoro arrived at Brooklyn General, flanked by expensive lawyers, and accompanied by a psychiatric evaluation team that Markovich had somehow mobilized in less than 2 hours. Clara watched through the examination room's observation window as a carefully orchestrated performance began in the hospital corridor. "My husband is having a breakdown," Celeste announced to the assembled medical staff, her voice carrying the perfect mixture of concern and authority. "He's become obsessed with conspiracy theories about our household staff, and now he's subjected our infant son to unnecessary medical procedures based on paranoid delusions." It was a masterful strategy. Paint Matteo as mentally unstable while positioning herself as the protective mother, trying to shield her child from his father's irrational behavior. Clara realized she was witnessing a textbook example of how abusers weaponize their victims' efforts to seek help. But Celeste had made one crucial miscalculation. She had underestimated the evidence that Camilla had gathered and Clara's determination to present it publicly. Dr. Wynne, Detective Santos, appeared at Clara's elbow, having arrived with impressive speed. "I understand you have documentation of ongoing child abuse." Clara handed over the tablet containing video evidence, the laboratory analysis of contaminated feeding materials, and medical records documenting the pattern of illness following Celeste's care. Detective Santos reviewed everything with the methodical attention of someone who had seen too many cases where wealth and influence had protected abusers from consequences. "This is solid evidence," she said finally, "but prosecuting someone connected to Gregor Markovich, that's going to require careful handling." "What kind of careful handling?" "The kind where we build such an airtight case that political pressure becomes irrelevant." Through the observation window, Clara could see Celeste's performance beginning to falter. The psychiatric evaluation team was asking detailed questions about Milo's medical history, and her carefully rehearsed answers weren't aligning with the documented timeline of his illness. Clara's phone rang. Camilla's voice was urgent, breathless. "Clara, you need to know something. I found Mrs. Celeste's medical records in Mr. Santoro's study. She's been treated for severe postpartum depression and anxiety, but she stopped taking medication 3 months ago without telling anyone." "Why didn't Matteo mention this?" "I don't think he knew. The treatment was arranged through her father's private physicians. Complete confidentiality, no communication with family members." The information reframed everything Clara thought she understood about Celeste's motivations. This wasn't simple cruelty or calculated abuse. This was untreated mental illness manifesting in the most dangerous possible way. Clara found Matteo in the hospital corridor, surrounded by lawyers and hospital administrators who were trying to navigate the legal and political complexities of the situation. "We need to talk," she said, pulling him aside, "about Celeste's psychiatric history." As Clara explained what Camilla had discovered, she watched Matteo's expression shift from anger to something approaching understanding. Not forgiveness. The damage to Milo was too severe for that, but recognition that his wife's actions stemmed from illness rather than malice. "It doesn't change what happened to Milo," he said finally. "No, but it changes how we handle what happens next." Detective Santos emerged from her review of the evidence with a grim expression. "We have enough for criminal charges. But given the psychiatric circumstances, the district attorney will probably recommend treatment in a secure facility rather than prison." "And Milo?" "Full custody to the father, supervised visitation only after successful completion of psychiatric treatment. The child will be monitored by court-appointed advocates to ensure his safety." Through the observation window, Clara could see Celeste finally breaking down as the weight of evidence overwhelmed her ability to maintain the performance. She wasn't collapsing into guilt or remorse. She was retreating into the mental illness that had driven her to poison her own child. "She needs help," Clara said quietly. "She needs to be stopped from hurting Milo," Matteo replied. "Everything else is secondary." But Clara could see in his expression that stopping Celeste wouldn't be enough. The real victory would come in Milo's recovery, physically, emotionally, developmentally. The baby who had learned that feeding meant pain would need to learn trust again, would need to discover that the world could be safe and nurturing rather than constantly threatening. "It's going to take time," Clara told him. "Months, maybe longer, for Milo to recover fully. "Then we have time," Matteo said, "as much as it takes." The legal machinery was already in motion, but Clara understood that the most important work was just beginning, the careful, patient process of helping a damaged child learn to trust the world again. 6 months later, the nursery bore no resemblance to the sterile perfection that had once characterized the Santoro mansion. Gone were the museum-quality furnishings and clinical monitoring equipment, replaced by the comfortable chaos of actual childhood, colorful toys scattered across soft rugs, finger paintings taped to walls, books worn soft from countless readings. Clara sat in the rocking chair where she had first held a failing Milo, watching him navigate his walker with the determined enthusiasm of a healthy 16-month-old. His transformation was remarkable. Bright eyes that tracked movement with curiosity rather than wariness, chubby cheeks that spoke of proper nutrition, and most importantly, the fearless laugh of a child who had learned to trust that the world wouldn't hurt him. "He's gained 12 pounds, Clara reported to Matteo, who stood in the doorway with the relaxed posture of someone who no longer lived in constant fear for his son's safety. "Motor development is age-appropriate, cognitive function is excellent, and his attachment responses are completely normal." Translation for the non-medical professional: "Your son is going to be fine." The words carried weight beyond simple medical assessment. Milo's recovery had required months of careful nutritional rehabilitation, developmental therapy, and patient rebuilding of basic trust. But children were remarkably resilient, and with proper care, even the deepest damage could heal. Matteo moved into the room, settling onto the floor where Milo immediately abandoned his walker in favor of climbing onto his father's lap. The ease of their interaction was another victory. The bond that Celeste's illness had disrupted was now stronger than it had ever been. "What about Celeste?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer from the regular updates Matteo provided. "Stable. The medication has helped significantly with the postpartum depression and anxiety disorders. Her therapist says she's beginning to understand how her illness affected her judgment." He paused, his expression growing more complex. "She asks about Milo constantly, wants to know when she can see him again." "And what do you tell her?" "The truth. That supervised visitation will be possible when the court-appointed psychiatrist determines it's safe for Milo, not before." Clara nodded approvingly. The legal resolution had been more compassionate than many abuse cases. Celeste was receiving treatment in a private psychiatric facility rather than facing criminal prosecution, but Milo's protection remained the priority. Supervised visits had begun 3 months ago and were gradually increasing in frequency as Celeste demonstrated emotional stability. "She's still his mother," Clara said carefully. "When she's well, Milo will benefit from having a relationship with her." "I know, but Clara..." Matteo's voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to balance forgiveness with vigilance. "I'll never again put anyone's needs before my son's safety. Not Celeste's, not my own, not even yours." "Good. That's exactly how a father should think." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jade, who entered the nursery with the confident stride of someone whose health had been fully restored. Her transplant surgery, performed at NYU 6 months earlier, had been completely successful. The experimental treatment protocols that Matteo had funded were now being offered to other patients with similar conditions. "How's our favorite patient?" Jade asked, settling onto the floor where Milo immediately crawled toward her with excited babbling. "Thriving," Clara replied, watching the interaction with professional satisfaction. Milo's ability to form attachments with multiple caregivers was another sign of his complete recovery. Jade looked up at Clara with the knowing expression of someone who had witnessed her friend's transformation over the past months. "So what's next for Dr. Clara Wynne? Back to Brooklyn General's emergency room?" Clara had been dreading this conversation, though she knew it was inevitable. Her leave of absence was ending, and decisions had to be made about her future, but the answer had been crystallizing in her mind for weeks. "Actually, I've been offered a position heading pediatric care for the Santoro Foundation." Matteo's expression showed carefully controlled hope. "You haven't given me an answer yet, because I wanted to be sure Milo was completely recovered before making any decisions based on emotion rather than medical judgment." And now, Clara looked around the nursery, transformed from a place of hidden abuse into a space of genuine love and safety. She thought about the foundation Matteo was building, focused on child welfare and maternal mental health support. She thought about the resources that would be available to help children whose families couldn't afford private health care, whose abuse might go unnoticed without someone willing to look beyond surface appearances. The Foundation's mission statement mentions serving children who can't advocate for themselves, she said. It does. And the position would involve investigating cases where standard medical protocols aren't sufficient. Among other responsibilities, Clara smiled, feeling pieces of her life clicking into place with satisfying precision. Then yes, I accept. Matteo's relief was visible, but he remained cautious. There's something else we need to discuss. What's that? He moved closer, his expression shifting from professional to something much more personal. The foundation work is important, but it's not the only reason I want you to stay. Clara felt her pulse quicken as Matteo took her hands in his. Through the nursery windows, afternoon sunlight streamed across Central Park, painting everything in golden warmth that felt like hope made visible. Clara, you saved my son's life, but more than that, you saved mine. You showed me what it means to choose truth over convenience, to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. He paused, studying her face with the intensity that had once intimidated her, but now felt like coming home. I love you, and I'm hoping that maybe you feel the same way. Clara looked down at Milo, who had fallen asleep in Jade's arms with the complete trust of a child who knew he was safe. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, the investigation that had nearly destroyed them, the courage required to confront difficult truths, the slow rebuilding of trust and love. I do feel the same way, she said softly. But Matteo, I need you to understand something. I'll never be someone who stays quiet when I see something wrong. I'll never choose family loyalty over a child's safety. If you're looking for someone who won't challenge you, I'm looking for someone who will challenge me to be better than I thought I could be, he interrupted. Someone who will never let me forget that power exists to protect people, not to control them. Clara smiled, feeling the last of her reservations dissolve. Then yes, to all of it. The foundation, the future, everything we're going to build together. Matteo leaned down to kiss her, and in that moment, Clara understood that the greatest victory wasn't solving the case or saving Milo's life. It was learning that love, real love, wasn't something that could be bought or negotiated or controlled. It was something that had to be proven through courage, demonstrated through choices, and earned through the willingness to fight for what mattered most. In the soft afternoon light of the nursery, surrounded by the evidence of healing and hope, Clara knew that she had found something worth every risk she had taken to get here. Hope you enjoyed the story today. Subscribe for more stories like this and don't forget to hit like. Tell us in the comments what you thought. See you next time.